Okay, juniors, we'll talk a little bit more here about our continuing unit on the modern presidencies. We get into Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush here this afternoon. So, Ronald Reagan, also known as the Great Communicator, also a former actor, a former governor of California. He had ran for the Republican nomination previously. He lost that nomination to Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford then lost to Jimmy Carter for the presidency in 1976. But, anyways, talking more about Ronald Reagan, who will be elected in 1980 and serve 2 terms, was the oldest elected president at the time. President Donald Trump is now has him surpassed for being the oldest when he was first elected in 2016. But, anyways, Ronald Reagan, kind of viewed as like the father of conservatism, I guess, and really a kind of the spokesperson for the conservative movement of the 1980s. So Reagan, as far as domestic policy, again, one of the things he was best known for was his policy of what becomes known as Reaganomics, or supply side economics, that was really characterized by 3 things: budget cuts in the federal budget, trying not to spend as much; tax cuts, mostly for those of the upper middle class and the wealthy; and increased defense spending, and talk about like the Star Wars initiatives. And he believed that these things would change around the economy for the United States. Now, again, we will see for a period of time, we will see an economic boom closer to the middle 80s. Right away, his presidency in the early 80s, there was still some of that economic stagflation and things like that. But eventually, we will see lower unemployment, greater GDP, but also we'll see a higher budget deficit. And a lot of that kind of goes back to defense spending. But basically, Reaganomics called for these 3 things, and then hoping that eventually what would happen is that with the tax cuts for the wealthy, that would limit borrowing, and then eventually banks would be able to borrow more money to business, and then that would kind of trickle down to everybody else in the United States. So Reaganomics, somewhat controversial. Some people, again, political matter, thought it was a great thing. Some others, not so much. We did see reduction in some federal spending, like on food stamp programs, Medicaid, which is something that's used for usually those that are economically challenged. It's kind of a form of supplemental health care that's sponsored by the federal government. And we also saw reduced spending in student loans too, which also led to higher interest rates for individuals who maybe borrowed money from the federal government for student loans. Student loans present day through the federal government, the interest rate on them is anywhere from kind of depending on from 5 to 8%. In the 1980s, I heard of federal student loans that had high interest rates of like 14 to 20%, kind of depending on. But Reagan called for reduced spending in those regards, with the idea of doing the fiscally correct thing in his mind. Okay, so somewhat controversial, and I'll let you kind of develop your own opinion on it. Other things he was known for was the war on drugs and the Just Say No campaign. That was something that was more so sponsored by the First Lady, Nancy Reagan, his wife. And then we also talk about Cold War stuff. And again, Reagan kind of combating communism and wanting to destroy them. That's where he'll also focus a lot of his foreign policy. We've already talked Cold War stuff, so we'll leave that alone. As far as foreign policy, though, a lot of what he did was geared towards ending communism. So there was things that happened during his presidency that happened in Grenada and in Nicaragua and Panama. But something else that happens too, where it was kind of a scandal, was the Iran-Contra affair, where the United States Congress had passed some legislation that banned the United States working with the Contras. The Contras were a rebel group in Nicaragua that were going to overthrow a communist, who was believed to be a communist sympathizer, communist leader. There had been some laws passed that the United States wasn't supposed to work with them and that kind of thing. And then at the same time, there was also some issues with Iran where there had been embargoes passed and the United States wasn't supposed to deal with them either. But eventually what happened is the Reagan administration okayed arms sales to Iran, who was fighting Iraq at the time. And then they used that money from the sales to fund the Contras, who were, this rebel group in Nicaragua. And that looked really bad. Reagan, a lot of people don't know this, there was talk of impeachment. Obviously that didn't happen, but a number of his cabinet members and some other officials got in trouble. Eventually they all get pardoned, though, by the president that comes after Reagan, who was his vice president, George H.W. Bush. So George H.W. Bush serves 1 term as president, gets elected in 1988 and he'll serve from 1989 to 1993, and Bill Clinton will defeat him in the 1992 election. We'll talk more about that tomorrow. But H.W. Bush had served as VP under Reagan. Reagan had served his 2 terms, so he was out. And again, George H.W. Bush didn't have as much success on the domestic front as he did on the foreign front. Again, there was still some economic issues in the late 80s. We see that'll happen especially with our stock market. But as far as important things that he got done on the domestic front, he did sign into law the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's going to prevent discrimination of those with disabilities, especially like in housing and in the job markets. And he also signed the Clean Air Act amendments that added on to the Clean Air Act of the 1960s, looking for alternative fuel sources for the purpose of preserving the environment and such. Did have more success with foreign policy. Talk about things that happened in Panama with some of the different things going on there and leadership. But the one thing where he does get a lot of credit for is the Persian Gulf War. That is where Saddam Hussein's regime, Iraq, is going to invade Kuwait. And again, there was some implications there with oil and such. Eventually what does happen is there will be George H.W. Bush will use some military power as president. And what eventually will happen is the United States will liberate Kuwait from Saddam Hussein in Operation Desert Storm. And that was something where he is oftentimes heralded for that foreign policy. But again, he'll get in 1992, he'll be defeated by Bill Clinton. So we'll talk more about that tomorrow.